Hello, everyone. Hello. Hopefully you can see me. Hopefully you can see the captioning as well. Hopefully it's working with the voice interpreters and everything. Hi, everyone. My name is Lorianne Macko, and I am thrilled to welcome you to our fourth in our series of webinars. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I am thrilled to be providing this webinar with the NSF and to providing this to our alumni and our entire NTID RIT community. Thank you for joining us today. Again, this is the fourth in our webinar series, and we'll talk about the rest of those that we have planned a little bit later on. For today, we are fortunate to have Dr. Joseph Hill with us. Before I introduce him, I just want to briefly say thank you to our two interpreters that we have with us today, Angela Hauser and Emily Call. We also have a captionist, and you'll be able to find that transcript at the bottom of your screen. You can click to have subtitles on or off, depending on your preference. And our captionist today is Lenore Chaz. So thank you so much to all three of our access service providers. We are also going to be doing a Q&A session. And so if you take a look at the bottom of your screen, there is a box for Q&A. You can type in any questions you have, and we'll be answering those questions at the end of the presentation. Hopefully we'll get to every question that you have, all right? So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Joseph Hill. He is an associate professor at NTID. He works in the department, ASLIE department, which is the ASL and Interpreting Education department. He is one of the leading experts in this topic, and we are so fortunate to have him with us today. Dr. Hill has been studying this topic throughout his whole career, focusing on the Black deaf community, recording their history, culture, and diving into their language. So I'm thrilled to introduce to you Dr. Hill, and I'm going to give him the floor, and he will start his presentation. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen with everyone. We're going to be talking about Black Deaf and Black ASL. Maybe some of you already know this information, maybe you don't, but we have a wide range of information that we're going to be talking about: history, culture, and language. We'll go through all of that, talk about past history, focus on schools, laws that were established, and then talk about a book as well related to Black and Deaf in America. And then we'll have some various videos from projects that we've worked on, and we'll talk about what the future looks like in this area. Obviously, for this presentation, we're going to be speaking on race and the impact of language just in general. When people think of race, you think of race itself, but when you relate that to language, for example, visual language, think about 2020 and all that is happening in our times right now with the police, with the community, and for people of color.
Also, you see people who try to avoid racism, but still will use language to discriminate. You could see it in the quote from Walt Wolfram in my presentation. He's a social linguist who studies African American English along with the person who said the second quote, John Rickford, who is also a social linguist. Social linguist studies the relationship between language and culture. It is also my field. Both Wolfram and Rickford note that people will often substitute language discrimination for racism, claiming that they're not well spoken or are using broken English. This implies things like a poor education or other factors that some think may justify, for example, not renting them an apartment. So it's important to look at how language can be used to privilege some and disadvantage others. That's part of what we'll discuss today.
Now, related to the book that I was telling you about, and how I was talking about Wolf and what he had been focusing on, there was a DVD that was related to this book when it first came out. And what we've done now is remove that, and everything is online. We have lots of videos that are connected to this book, The Hidden Treasure. And so each chapter itself, chapter 1 will have a film or a video online that coincides with it, as well as chapter 2 and so forth. And so we're looking at various data that has been collected. The book focuses on Black deaf people in residential schools for the deaf. And the gold, really linguistically, when we were looking at various films that we videotaped and studied signs and parts of signs, facial expression, movement, we were looking at white signers versus Black signers. Of course, there weren't many, but we were collecting as much film as we could, looking at linguistics, checking out the data, seeing the sign usage, and that was the information that we were collecting. Many people were very curious as to what Black Sign Language looks like and what the difference is. And so there are 8 different features that I'll be talking about. And of course, that information has been distributed currently. We have been looking at it in the past, and we're going to touch on all of those features just to help you get a sense and a better understanding of Black ASL.
Now, I can't see all of you, but usually when I give this talk, I ask the audience to think about something that usually comes in a metal can, an aluminum can, with a pop tab. When you open it, what's inside usually fizzes and you drink it. What do you call the liquid in the can? Answers will include pop, soda, or Coke, or something else entirely. There's a variety of names for this drink, and different people will tend to prefer different words. Now, is this a random phenomenon? No, there is a reason for it, and you could see it here on this map. Now, if you use the word pop, you could look for it on this map and see that pop is used mostly in the blue area between Washington State and Oregon, all the way east to parts of New York State. Maybe that fits you. You might say, well, I use pop, and sure enough, I'm from Michigan, for example. I know I'm from Ohio, and I definitely use pop, so it makes sense to me. If you use soda, you can see it on the map, a big area around California. A little cluster in the middle of the map, then some more in the northeast. If it fits, that makes sense. As for Coke, it's important to understand that in this context, Coke doesn't just mean the drink in the red can with white lettering. It applies to all soft drinks. For example, orange soda might be called Coke. Even Sprite might be called Coke. Ginger ale, also Coke. It becomes a generic term for soft drinks. This kind of thing is based on region and on history and the length of time involved. So far, we've been talking about English, not sign language. Now let's look at sign language.
Now this map here, this was published in 1995. And this data was collected of 8 different cities. This was the largest collection. Yeah, you think 8 cities is not large, but that was a large collection. And so we're looking at specific vocabulary and variations in the vocabulary. We're looking at the phonology and the variations in phonology. For example, if you were to sign early, you can sign it backwards or forwards. The hand shape is the same, it's just a variation in the movement. Or no, it's a locational difference. For example, chicken. Some people sign chicken, some people sign it this way. There are various ways that you may see that one word, depending on where you're from, the location of which you live. Now, to look at this, Black deaf. If you ask someone if you are familiar about Black deaf people coming together and gathering, you will see various things appear in the communication. And of course, that's obvious. In general, you would see that in any language. But we want to look at words and the signs of each word. They're different, and you're going to notice those differences. For example, if you were to see a picture of, like on the left here, the beaker, all of the containers, you would equate all of that to the word science, which we sign science here. Now in North Carolina, in that state, science is signed this way. That's their sign for science. Now, if you look at the middle picture, a towel, we may sign it like this, or like this. You may also see it in this way. Now that's a North Carolina sign. Black deaf people sign towel in the past that way. And in the very last picture, the sign for bathroom. North Carolina signs bathroom this way. All of the words that I showed you, other states from residential schools for the deaf that had Black people in there may sign it differently. Like Texas, they signed it this way. Virginia residential schools would sign it this way. Bathroom. So you're going to see a variation depending on location. And when seeing all these variations of English vocabulary, really, you have to look at all of the language and its history and its location. People will use words, some based on sound, some based on location, where they're living, some based on, their identity and social distancing of others. They may not be influenced by other people in another area, and so then they have their one sign. Now, of course, we're talking about the past with this picture and looking at this timeline from American slavery on. We all know what slavery looks like. I think you can understand, and if you don't know, you can definitely look online. You can get books. 12 Years a Slave. Roots is a movie you could look at. You can see the atrocities that occurred during slavery. But if we focus on the yellow area on this timeline, and residential schools in that area were also segregated.
People often think of racism as something that happens between a person and another person. where one degrades or demeans the other based on their skin color. To them, it's just one-on-one phenomenon. It's a person discriminating against or oppressing another person. Looking at the diagram, you could see where it fits into the blue area, discrimination based on prejudice and bigotry. But for Black Americans, we are often really thinking about structural or systemic racism. That means the entire system we exist in, policy, institutional behavior, cultural representation, media representation, is built to oppress on a constant basis. Even if everything looks fine to you on a day-to-day basis, the functioning of the system itself is continually harming Black people. If you're a white person and you think everything appears to be fine and functioning properly, the truth is that in some ways, whether intentionally or not, you are helping ensure that the process of oppression continues. Another form of racism is internalized. Black Americans are constantly subjected to negative messaging about themselves. That messaging can be internalized and then turn against other Black people. So we have Black people blaming other Black people for perpetuating their own oppression. These are the three main forms of racism. For today, we're going to focus on structural racism.
For example, structural racism, here's a perfect example. If you look at this picture here, of course, this is a previous picture, a historical picture of Chicago. Think about families with children who purchase a home. They want to feel safe, want to feel comfortable and secure, and want to go to look for a place to purchase. They may not have the money to do that and may need to actually secure a loan, a homeowner's loan. So if you are a white family and you go to the bank and you secure a loan and you move into the neighborhood. Now a Black family who wants to secure a loan may go to the bank and be denied. And so now they haven't received that loan. Also, if you're looking at this map, you're going to also see here on the side, the lake. Now people would not allow a lot of Black people to live in that area.
The yellow on the map is the white neighborhoods, where white families would be encouraged to move. Real estate is a form of intergenerational wealth. So over time, as property values increase, the gap between the whites and the Black wealth only grew. The roots of the gap stem from redlining. So these policies enacted a long time ago continue to still have a visible effect today. And though redlining is now illegal and banks can't discriminate in lending, they often will categorize Black families as high risk, setting them up to default on loans and eventually undergo foreclosure. That still happens today.
Another thing we saw in the past, Black Americans wanting to fight for equal rights and whites oppressing that or blocking that. Now you see the existence of Black Lives Matters. And so you'll see what has happened in the past is still being carried forward. And so there has not been that improvement. So Black Lives Matter actually was established to show that, you know, all lives may matter, but when you come against specific situations and someone is not hearing you or listening to you and you are oppressed, that then nothing has changed. And you can see on this timeline here different things that have occurred, what's happened in the past, and that it still persists. You would think that we would be done with it, but here we are again with those things. So before I move on, I just wanted to talk about intersectionality. And this is the sign that I use. Think of various identities, deaf, hearing, so forth, and then the systems that fit into those various identities and how they connect or collide. So that's where the sign comes from. So the identities, you don't have just one identity. You have to think about the system that you're living in as a person. And so for me, as a Black deaf man, and maybe there's a Black deaf female, we may have similar experiences in a way, but a woman is going to have a very different experience than I am as a man. So there are going to be some sectionalities that they have that I don't have. Or vice versa. And you can see pretty clearly up here, white deaf males. And you can see, of course, if you're deaf, then the equality is a little bit less. But then if you add anything onto that, race or gender, when it comes to salary, you're going to see that they're going to be behind even more.
So before 1865, the end of the Civil War, slavery was still practiced in the South, which meant that Black people in the South had no right to education. Although there are pockets of free Black people, the vast majority of Black Americans in the South were enslaved. In the North, although, again, there were areas where slavery was still practiced, it had been outlawed in most of the northern states, so Black people, including Black deaf children, were able to go to school. This was not the case in the South. So the schools for the deaf in the northern states were integrated. There were Black deaf students going to schools for the deaf in Ohio and Connecticut before 1865. But in the South states like North Carolina and South Carolina, for example, Black children weren't allowed to attend white deaf schools. After 1865, well, there's a short video I'd like to show you depicting 17 different states starting around 1865, showing the number of years between when a Black deaf school was established and when it was integrated. After 1954, when segregation was banned. You can see that some southern states held out for a while after 1954. So this graph shows the number of years between establishment of Black deaf schools to desegregation. What that video shows is the time between the establishment of a Black deaf school and its integration with a white deaf school. You can see that the longest stretch happened in Washington, D.C., at Kendall Elementary School, which took 101 years to integrate. Then Louisiana was the last state to set up a Black deaf school in 1937, I think. So that's a long time after DC School for Black Deaf Children was set up. Then Louisiana was also one of the last to integrate in 1978. Bear in mind that states weren't able to fully integrate right away. In 1954, many took 6, 10, even 15 years. Now, I want to highlight one school for the deaf in particular, one whose history is fascinating. In Texas, although most schools for the deaf tend to be either exclusively for deaf students or include blind students, their schools for the deaf included students who were deaf, blind, or orphans. So this school educated hearing orphans alongside students who were deaf or blind. Here's a short video with more information.
Very interesting. Just the history of the groups within the schools for the deaf. Hearing orphans were also included. And now looking more at a different timeline, because we've already talked about the establishment of Black deaf schools. Prior to that, the segregation that had occurred, but the parallels of the language, you know, deviating from each other and then being integrated. And you'll see the differences from that. Now in this book that was published in 1983, there was it's called Black and Deaf in America. And this really just showed how Black people signed with their families, with their friends, socialization that occurred, and just the differences that we had within the group. And then our study that we did most recently in the comparison between the two. And that study was specifically in Texas. Now, if we look back at various states that had residential schools for Black deaf students, of course, we didn't have them in every area, but the National Science Foundation did not have enough of information on a wide range, so we picked 6. These are the 6 that are up here: North Carolina, Texas, Arkansas, Alabama, Virginia, and Louisiana. And so we went to all of those areas and picked 2 groups from each state.
Over 55. Why? Because they experience segregation. We also focus on adults under 35 because they grew up post-integration.
And we looked at all of that. And then what I'll do is I'll show you a film of people in Texas and specific signs that they used and what they look like. And this is a group of senior citizens, so 55 and up. Next, I'd like to show you people who are 55 years old or up in Louisiana. Very interesting to look at that and see the signs, the differences in the numbers that they used for the days of the week. Now, these are people in Texas, age 35 or below, and I want to show you the variations in their signs, which is very different from that of senior citizens. Very interesting as well. You can definitely see the differences and the variations. Now, there's another film I'd like to show you as well. This is new, and it's from Signing Black in America, which is actually going to come out this year. I've been working for a total of 2 years now, and it will pretty soon, it will be released. But this is talking about deaf family in Louisiana and the signs of modern times. So take a look at this. Interesting as well. And you see all of those ranges of ages and areas. Now, they did have some studies prior to this. There was an essay that I actually found that was published in 1965 from a book from Dictionary of American Sign Language. And that was one of the first publications that actually listed specific examples and representations of what the signs look like and the variations within the signs. And if you look in the back, it actually talks about Black deaf sign language, but specifically in the South. And so that was from the 1970s where the study was done. And it talks about the phonology of the language. And then in the 80s, we started to see more representation from various areas and various cities. So you start to see more coming up until today, when we're really starting to look back and replicate some of the information that we've had in the past and see what has been maintained in the language now, like in the 80s, or has left. For example, two-handed versus one-handed signs, like have or have with just one hand. And both are fine. Want, don't want. Looking at that and looking at Black deaf people again and seniors and their signs, and you notice that both generations prefer two-handed signs. Another one, talking about location, for example, no on the top of the head, the top head location, or some people say no where it's closer to the cheek or down on the chin. And of course, all of them are acceptable. Some people call them lazier signs if they're down. That's more judgmental. So we're not looking at judging. We're looking at what's being done, and that's it, and collecting data on that. So I've seen differences in location, differences in signs. Some of them are preferences, like no, don't know, what for. And you'll see them either be close to the top of the head or further down on the head. So we found those when looking at the signs. We also looked at signing space, and we noticed that there were bigger signs often, not all the time, but often within the Black community. Like if somebody's running or leaving, you'll see the signs will reach further. If someone is spelling a noun, it may be small, but if someone is pointing or using a gesture, you're going to see it bigger. We see repetition in signs, more body shifting. Much more often we see that in Black deaf, in the actual socializing and conversational signs. Now for the vocabulary, like I just gave you examples of, obviously you see the difference. Older Black deaf people, when you're looking at, you'll see their signs, but the more younger generation, African American English, you will see that come up, like
boy, bye.
My bad, those kind of things. Those are regional Black cultural words that will show up in the sign language. So you will see those appear more frequently in the language, which is very different. And you will see those on the mouth, whereas older deaf tend not to use their mouth a lot, and younger deaf will then mouth a lot of those words. So those were differences that we saw, and that's incorporated in the newer study that we're doing, which also focuses on rhythm. Black deaf versus white deaf, and what the rhythm of the sign is. We're looking at race as well as gender, and you notice differences for both of them, you know.
It's a small data set.
But we are noticing more, and we're adding, and now we're noticing more differences. So I'd like to show you now this film, which talks about Black deaf people's view on sign and the pride that they have in the way in which they use the language. It's based on various topics that came up, and you'll see it in here. Let me show it to you. It talks about what deaf culture, what's, better, and what they view. So here it is. The next one is definitely from a newer documentary. One of our co-authors who wrote a book, Carolyn Magaskill. So this is her own story in Alabama at a residential school for the deaf that was segregated, talking about leaving that school and then moving to a mixed school and what the feeling was. So let me show you this. And here's the name of the film, Signing Black in America. Now, prior to closing, I showed you the young Black deaf group and their signs and what they felt about their own signs in the past compared to now is definitely more positive, more sense of pride, and you can see that. So, from all of the historical information to now and what we've learned, let me show you that. Based on previous studies, we've really looked at differences based on identifiers that we saw: language, culture, location, all of that included. And in the past, of course, the Black deaf culture has not stayed the same. It's changed just like the white deaf culture has changed. Educational, mainstreaming, desegregation, all of that has been an influence. Now, what we don't know. So far, we've studied Black deaf individuals in specific areas from California, New York City, Michigan, but there are so many other places that we don't know throughout the United States. And so what we need is to really start collecting more data from various areas. We need to work on that to incorporate it. Black deaf students who are in schools right now, what do their signs look like? That's another question mark. That's going to be completely different from their older counterparts. And so we need to get that information. That's an unknown. Also, the stylish variations in how they're represented. We need to get more of a study on that based on the location. The last thing I wanted to do to close, there's some really beautiful words that really touched me. And I wanted to show you that. Really good. Now, if you'd like to see that actual film, you can see it on PBS. It's not national. You have to actually request it in your local area. The PBS station in your area, because there are specific cities that have it already, you can contact them and say that you would like to see that film added to their programming, and they will make that available. So I definitely have some acknowledgements, of course, first to the National Science Foundation, Spencer Foundation, who provided support to me. Also, I want to thank the Black Deaf community who was involved, allowed me to document and look at the history and their language. And I want to say thank you to all of you. Now what we're going to do is open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you. This is Lorianne speaking. So what I'm going to do is sign the questions that have come up in the QA box, and then you can answer. So it looks like we have several questions ready. I'm going to start at the top and go down to the bottom. So our first question for you, Dr. Hill, is internalized racism the same as disconscious racism? Could you speak to that? I'm seeing these words of internalized versus disconscious racism. And are those two concepts the same? Could you speak to that a little bit? And this is Dr. Hill speaking. So it's internalized racism and what? This is Lorianne speaking. Internalized racism versus disconscious racism. This is Dr. Hill speaking. I would say that
Disconscious racism is a type of racism that's accepted unquestioningly. It's just the way life works. People go about day to day without thinking much about it. Internalized racism, on the other hand, is more about taking perceptions and attitudes from society toward Black or brown people and project them into their own people. It can also include self-hatred, for example. So I hope you could see the difference.
Lorianne saying, okay, wonderful. So the next question I have for you, one of our participants asked about the way to sign Black. They've seen Black signed with a 1 hand shape, and it's signed with a B hand shape as well. And this person was told that the B hand shape was to be used only by the POC Black community. And they're asking if this is true. And this is Dr. Hill speaking.
I get this question all the time.
So you have 2 signs for Black, one with a 1 hand shape, one with a B hand shape, and there's a lot of discussion about who it's appropriate to use, which sign. I think for the Black community, signing Black with a B hand shape, that's fine. In some areas, white people can do that as well. And in other areas, the Black deaf community feels a lot of ownership over signing Black with a B hand shape. I'm seeing a lot of discussion, a lot of discourse around this, and it seems like this topic is still evolving. I think right now, what you're seeing is that the B hand shape used for Black is really referencing a lot of culture. It has a strong cultural connotation versus signing Black with the 1 hand shape. So I believe that's where the conversation around that is going at the moment. And this is Lorianne. Yes, it seems to be an evolving conversation. Our next question is what kind of advice you would have for teachers who want to include this topic more in their education. This is Dr. Hill speaking. I think it's important to look for resources. At the end of this presentation, I have a lot of resources. You can go ahead and look at my website. You can look at Dr. Joseph, www.josephchill.com. If you go there, you'll be able to see a lot of my research, and you'll be able to, most importantly, find resources. I have resource lists available for people who are looking for more information, and that's a great place to start in getting this information into your classroom. It's not perfect, it's not a complete list, but when I do find more resources, I update it. So that's available for the community. And this is Lorianne. I want to jump to another question. Some people have been asking about where they can find this presentation in terms of the recording. So I wanted to let all of our participants know that this presentation will be put on YouTube. There'll be a transcript, there will be captions, and once we get all of the editing together for the video, it will be on YouTube. So just to let our participants know. Our next question is, as we become more aware of Black signs, are there signs other than how to sign Black person that as a white person I should not use? So as people are becoming aware of their signing choices, are there resources about where they can find appropriate signs, inappropriate signs? Do you have any suggestions for that? And this is Dr. Hill speaking. I mean, I try to keep a list of resources of, appropriate signs, but really it changes so quickly, it's impossible to keep it up. English changes so fast, the words that people used 10 years ago are not the words people use today, and it's the same thing in sign language. So documenting that is a challenge. Linguists are really struggling with the speed of language change. So it's important just to think about the signs that we're using today may not be appropriate in the future, and the signs that people have used in the past may also not be appropriate as well. It can become problematic. I think what I would tell people is try the best you can to educate yourself, talk to people, and pay attention to what you see community members using in conversation. And if someone calls you out on your language, just to be attentive to that. And this is Lorianne speaking. Yes, absolutely. That constant learning and awareness is key, I think. And we're running a little short on time, but we do have time for a few more. In terms of the emphasis on ASL, and that's what we've been talking about, but I'm curious if there are similar patterns in other countries' cultural sign languages, for example, French Sign Language, Italian Sign Language. Do you know if there are similarities between their sign language and American Sign Language? And this is Dr. Hill speaking. Are you talking about Black communities in those countries? Black signers in those countries? Honestly, I'm not sure. I would emphasize that linguistic variations develop based on history, and the history of racism in this country is incredibly strong. The culture of segregation that we had for so very long caused the linguistic variations to develop in the community. So you'd have to look at the history of these different countries and regions to determine what kind of language development trajectories people are going to be on. You can't take one country and apply that experience to others. There's going to be a whole mix of experiences throughout the world. In terms of the impact on language development, I really do think that you have to look at how people who were in isolation from each other start to develop their language and communication. If there was no segregation, if there was no isolation, then the language would probably develop, in parallel, and it all comes down to history. And this is Lorianne saying, I have time for one more question. We have a lot of other questions. So if your questions haven't been answered, don't worry, we're going to save these questions. We will give them to Dr. Hill, and we'll figure out how to get those answers available for you. So in terms of our last question, we did not have any Black deaf educators in our school. One of our attendees is saying, who would we contact to have someone come and teach their own culture rather than hearing it from us, the white deaf teachers? So who can we reach out to as a Black deaf student, how does that happen? And this is Dr. Hill saying, yeah, this is a huge problem. We don't have enough Black deaf teachers, and that's a big barrier for our Black deaf students. Even as you come through college, that support is missing. The barriers to success that exist in the educational system, such as testing or just general support barriers, that's a huge struggle for Black deaf students. And then once they graduate school and get out into the workplace, they experience the systemic racism that perpetuates in that system as well. This problem is complex, and you have to start changing at every level. They're starting to allow more changes. It's an incredibly complex situation. And this is Lorianne speaking. When you think about the whole system, you can see impacts on people's lives at every single stage of their development. And we have so many questions left to answer. We do unfortunately need to close the webinar now, but from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you, Dr. Hill, for sharing your time, your knowledge, your wisdom, and your research with us. Thank you so much for giving this presentation. And again, this is going to be uploaded to YouTube for our participants and our community to watch it. The last questions we weren't able to get to, we are going to give to Dr. Hill and let him answer those. So thank you so much for joining. Again, thank you for the interpreters and the captionists. For those of you who submitted some questions, thank you so much for your participation. If you're curious about more webinars or when this will be up, take a look at the NTID Alumni Association page. And thank you so much for coming. Once we get the YouTube link available, it will be able to be shared and everything. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again, Dr. Hill.